My guest today is Dr. Dean Burnett, who is currently an honorary research associate at Cardiff Psychology School, as well as a visiting industry fellow at Birmingham City University. He is variously known for being a neuroscientist, lecturer, author, blogger, podcaster, pundit, science communicator, and comedian, amongst other things, and writes for The Guardian, as well as having written for the LA Times, GQ, and The Telegraph. His latest book, Emotional Ignorance, is a journey into human emotion and throws up many surprises and a lot of insight into human emotions along the way. I am very, very excited to talk to you, Dean. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Much appreciated. Always a laugh.
I want to start off straight away with the fact that you didn't narrate the audiobook yourself. The narrator
Yeah.
Matt Haddis. Despite having heard you speak many times before, I was convinced at points this was you speaking. I don't know whether it's the Welshness of you both, but he captured the tone of your book exceptionally well. And I was just wondering if this was a decision that you chose to make, or was it outside of your hands to have someone else narrate it?
Bit of column A, bit of column B. I did think I would narrate the first book because like Matt's done all my audiobooks at this point. This is like the fourth because the kids' book I did hasn't had an audiobook for reasons which thus far remain unclear. But yeah, so Audible published the audiobooks that I've done. With the very first one, The Idiot Brain, I assumed I would read it because everyone else does their own. And they gave me this sort of trial, little test to see if I could do it. And while I do a lot of public speaking, I think I'm better at it than I was. But about 8 years ago, I was still rather a rapid speaker with sort of mumbled, garbled delivery, as your listeners and viewers will probably realize pretty soon. And I had this sort of little trial, and they said afterwards, well, we think it would be even more impressive for the book if we had a professional narrator do it, meaning they didn't think someone would listen to this for like 7 hours solid. So, all right, I didn't either, but I thought I'd have a go. And I said, well, can I at least ask for a Welsh person? And they found Matt Addis, who is the narrator of the books. But it has led to a few strange outcomes, one of which was my third audiobook, Psychological, which is an audiobook originally. I had several friends of mine who have experienced like the mental health system in various guises, because it's a book about mental health, how it works. And they're all in the book. They all do their own contributions, but I don't. So in my book, I got all my friends in it, but I'm not in it, which is a strange turn of events, which is only topped by the book talk I did, and I think it was in Stratford. I won't swear to it, but I think that's what it was, because I've done quite a few since. I did a sort of talk about the book, and this is the Idiot Brain, the first ever one I did. And afterwards I was signing, there's a nice little queue, I was happy, it was going very well. And a woman came up to me, again, this middle-aged woman I don't know, never met. She goes, just want to check, is there an audio version of the book? And I said, yes, there is actually. It's I think it was out. I said, yes, it's out. And she goes, do you narrate it? I said, no, it's not me actually. And she goes, oh, thank God, and walked off. Well, there we go. What a nice thing to be told by your adoring public. So Yes, it's a thing. But Matt's got my voice down very well now because me and him are sort of friends, and we met each
Yeah.
other in the book launch for the third book, and it was like a Doctor Who special, or like a Spider-Man meme, like it's you.
Yeah, it
So
is
yes,
strange meeting people in real life you've kind of known for a while in other venues
mm,
and kind of putting those two things together, isn't it?
yeah, it's in the book as well, like the whole online versus real world relationships. Why
Yeah.
some are more significant than others, but it's not as clear cut as that, and so on and so on. But yeah, it's a strange experience to make a real world connection with someone you've known for years. It's it hasn't happened before in human history.
Yeah, it's strange having that. I think one of those accents, as I know all too well, hosting a call-in show, and very often we get the comments afterwards asking for subtitles and whatnot for this
Mm.
strange little Yorkshireman for a predominantly American audience.
Well, I do a lot of videos like the advertise the books and stuff, and I know Instagram, TikTok, and all they have the AI generated captions now, and I am a struggle on this. You see them going, this question mark. I think he said Florence. No, I said hippocampus. Close enough. It's fine. It's
It's
fine.
near enough. In the
Yeah.
introduction to the book, you state that this wasn't a book that you actually set out to write. And in
Mm.
doing so, you came to grasp something that I try and stress to the skeptic and atheist community as much as possible. And that regardless of how rational we think we are emotional creatures. So, what
Mm.
led you to this realization?
Yeah, well, the book was meant to be a completely different prospect. Again, another incident after various other book talks. My second book, The Happy Brain, all about how what makes us happy and why, and why do certain things trigger the reward response and not others, etc., etc. Um, I'm proud of the book; it's well received. No complaints. But one of the questions I had after that, after the book talks, and for this one, a regular question was, "You wrote a book about happiness. Why not any other emotion?" Which it's not as neutral a question as you think. It's basically saying, "You wrote this book. Why don't you write a different book?" 'Cause thank you, glad you enjoyed it. Um, but it happened not often enough. I can think, well, maybe there is scope or there's interest out there in a book about emotions generally. Obviously, people are interested in emotions, in the abstract, in their own for their own sake. So I spoke to my publishers and thought, what I could do is do a sort of nice breezy book about emotions. In my head, as soon as I thought about it, what I'll do, it'll be chapter on fear, chapter on anger, chapter on guilt, and it'll all weave together nicely. I can see it how it worked in my head. I thought, that works perfect. That's very much in keeping with my style. It'll be an obvious follow-on. Suggested to my publishers. We thrashed out details, shook hands, and more importantly, signed a legally binding contract. And I sort of, I thought, well, okay, I'll start write this book. And as I sat down to write it, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake because I'd been teaching a psychiatry program for years at this point. I was like the main lecturer and taking over loads of mental health care stuff. And because of my background, all the basic psychology and neuroscience lectures fell to me. And I inherited a lot of them from other previous lecturers in the course who had since moved on. And there was lectures on emotions and stuff like that. But it was all this data and all this information, all these slides pre-prepared. And that combined with general attitudes in neuroscience that I'd encountered led me to believe that the science of emotion was kind of well established. It's a known thing. Sort of like how the fight or flight response is very, no one disputes that exists. It's a thing. We all know it's a thing. How it works and mechanisms thereof is still kind of debated, but it's there. It's not contentious. So I thought, obviously emotions are so fundamental, so blatant that in the oldie days of psychology, we studied those first, then okay, now that's how they work. Let's do the proper stuff, your thinking, your sensory experience, your imagination, your executive control and stuff like that. So that was I led to think. But it turns out I was wrong because it's more of a conspiracy of silence in the neuroscience world. Like there's like emotions, yep, those are a thing. Let's not look at them directly. It's a thing that happens with behavioral neuroscience. We never really mention the mind in any way, shape, or form because it's not something you can objectively assess. It has no quantitative aspects you can measure. So I'm just going to say, it's there. But we're just going to work around it. And the same with emotions and stuff. So I was sat down to write this book about emotions. I thought, well, I'll just do the basics. I'll do basically what's an emotion? first thing I got to start with the definition, like most books, go on from there. Oh, there doesn't seem to be one. And I sort of tried to find one and then found 12. And then, oh, which one of these is right? Found 63 and so on and so on and so on. And I sort of never got involved with former guest of yours, Dr. Richard Firth Godby here. And I
Yeah,
asked
yeah.
him because I said, I can't seem to find a definition of emotions. Can you point me towards one? And he did that laugh. When I imagine it's the laugh of like a grizzled war veteran when he's in the pub and someone says to him, "Oh, got a bit tasty at the paintball tournament last week. Did it now?" I'm
Yeah.
sorry, you must have been terrified. That's that sort of thing. Because it is a sort of really, really, it's a really contentious issue in the neuroscience world. And I realized if I can't even define emotions, what else is wrong? And I thought, no, all this idea of established body of science about emotions that I can easily explain to the general public is not there. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
But I fell down a wormhole of, oh God, this is so much going on. And the original title of the book was going to be Emotional Intelligence, because obviously that's a well-known phrase, but also I would be telling people the smarts about emotion. So I would seem emotionally intelligent and be intelligent about emotions, clever play on words. Then I thought, actually, I have no justification to that title. I'm not intelligent about emotions at all. I'm very ignorant. So the book became Emotional Ignorance, because then I sort of uncovered just how ignorant most people are about them. There's sort of a weird paradox on there. They're so familiar, everyone recognizes them, everyone can perceive them, sense them, knows what they are, but they don't. They don't really know. If you ask 50 people to write down the definition of emotions, they could all write one down maybe, but they'd all be 50 different things. And it's one of those. It's like art. They sort of say, "So you can recognize art? Yes. How? I don't know. I just can." It's one of those things. So, yeah, it became a much different prospect when I realized just how uncertain and how deeply fundamental they are. They're not like some sort of cognitive appendix, which we're just sort of trying to grow. They're embedded in every facet of our thinking and sort of perception. So, yeah, you can't get away from emotions. The idea that we can is more of a mainstream myth than anything else.
Yeah, and the great thing about your writing is that you put all this down in the book. You don't try and keep this a secret. That you kind of changed your plans throughout the writing process. Mentioning our mutual friend, Dr. Richard Firth Godby here, who was kind enough actually for the listeners to reach out to Dean on my behalf and put us in touch with each other. How important was his and the other people who contributed to your research on this book?
Oh, vital, really. Like I say, like the the position I put across, like I'm ignorant about emotions, that wasn't feigned. There was a slight bit of comic exaggeration, but it was very much a case of, oh, I'm really not in a world I know here. I'm so far outside my comfort zone that I didn't realize I was. I was like, sort of, was it Wile E. Coyote run off a cliff and then like halfway across he realizes there's no ground and just drops. That's what I was like in this. But it was Richard was the first person I reached out to because he was like my closest connection to someone who's directly involved in the world of emotions, and he sort of pointed me out. Here's a good place. Here's a good place. Here's a good place. This is where you should look at, and here's why it's important. Here's the background. So he was obviously the first port of call, and it was really useful to sort of just get if he didn't mean it this way, but he just showed me just how little I know about this world and how big a task I'd taken on. But it became sort of more and more manageable as time went on, and sort of as you sort of slowly but surely work your way through it, like sort of like slowly wading through quicksand to get out. It's scary at first, but no, just be calm, just be calm. It'll all come together. But there were lots of different people involved, like from different walks of life, because when it comes to experiencing emotions, there isn't really anyone who is exempt from that. Everyone's got
Yeah.
relevant experience there. I mean, good friend of mine who I included, Caris Leary, Welsh BAFTA winning actor, whatever. But she's like a good friend of mine, and we've sort of, because it's Wales, we all know each other. we met at the AGM, so we have one every year in Carmarthen. But she's a very, very, very openly emotional person. She's an actress and a trained performer, so that's not a world I've ever been part of. I don't know how this works, how to express yourself, but also to control that emotion. And so that was a very useful insight. She does some really heavy, gritty drama stuff, and that's not a world I've got any experience with. Dr. Katie Mack, like I was talking to her because she's obviously a very, very acclaimed astrophysicist, but her work on like the end of the universe, which is something which triggers a lot of existential dread in many
Yeah.
people. It's such a big deal for so many people, but also, you know, how do you deal with that? You're a proper scientist, you're a proper, you know, rational thinking, logical minded person, but you're also, you know, also you're a prominent woman in the world of science, which is itself a whole different kettle of fish. There's a lot of emotional aspects to it. And, you know, but how do you face this? You know, you're dealing with literally the end of all things. And what does that do for you? Like, how does that affect you and your colleagues? Um, and sort of like Chris Blackwell from Sheffield University, he works on the technological side of things. Like, one thing technology does struggle with, you know, we all think it's so much better than it's more powerful, but emotion is something it really can't quite get its virtual head around, because it's not something which you can program. Because if we don't even know what emotions are, we can't even like write them down as a definition in the dictionary. It's really hard to program them. You know, you can do. I mean, in machine learning, you can see responses and have reactions and stuff, but you know, you need context, you need nuance, you need prior experiences, you need appraisals, and this is all stuff which is really hard to work into machines. So like, but you know, there are ways around it. So looking for emotional cues and like learning about the software being used to monitor patients in therapy to see, you know, if they're on the verge of relapse because of the emotional content of their language and so on and so on. So but the contributors to the book, like all of them were just vital for steering me in not in the right direction. I don't think there's any particular right or wrong direction, but in what I would consider the most interesting, the most illuminating direction, because the way I write, like I'll have a skeleton of a book, and I thought, right, these are the chapters I envisage happening. But then I'll sit down to write them, and then I'll look up a source, because I try to source and reference everything I say, well, every claim I
Yeah.
make, because at first it was a disadvantage in me being like a science writer, because I never thought I'd be allowed to write a book when I first got into this world, because I'm not a prominent neuroscientist. Well, I'm now by sort of proxy, but I'm not actually a researcher then. I'm not a prominent researcher. I don't have a body of work to my name. I'm not like, Dean Burnett of the Burnett model of, you know, literary incontinence, which would be something I would be responsible for. But yeah, like I don't have like, you know, this prestigious work. I don't have anyone under me in a research lab. You know, I'm not the big science guy, as most people who write books are or have been, at least in the past. And I thought, well, I'm not a scientist of any repute. Why do I get to write a book? But that's not how it works. But because I'm not, I don't have a body of research to say, well, I'm right because look. I've always been far more cautious about saying, well, I think this. Let me find a source to back that up at least. I think I probably do it more than most scientists, because they have their own research to fall back on, whereas I don't. So, but this book has more references than anything, and as a result, I've sort of sit down and go, okay, I think this. 2 pages in, I have to reference that. Oh, can't find a reference, but I found a reference for this. Oh God, that changes that. Okay, let's go back to that and work it this way, and so on. And then you get other people involved, and then it spins it in another direction. So yes, it's a very organic process, but one which, you know, the contributors are, you know, essential.
Yeah, talking about your writing style, it is fair to say, I think, an accessible writer. You're humorous and you put forward difficult ideas in simple to understand language. You know, this is, I think, I read a lot of kind of books on science of the brain and whatnot. And I think this is your writing style is very important in communicating ideas about neuroscience, because you've got people like Antonio Damasio, who are
Mm.
absolutely brilliant in what they're communicating, but it's fair to say they're not the simplest, easiest read for the layperson.
Mm.
And you kind of cut through that and present these ideas in a clear, understandable way. How important do you think that is when we're talking about difficult concepts such as these?
I think it's almost like the most important thing, because it's sort of similar to the point I make in other areas about mental health awareness, which I'm obviously a massive proponent of and I think is essential. But it's also not the be all and end all. Like, one thing I've sort of complained about in the past is mental health awareness is great, but it's not like the end result is the first step. People are aware of mental health. Okay, but then what do you do about it? Like, it's like, I'm aware that I've got Wi-Fi. If it goes wrong, I can't do anything about it. Um, so like, I like to sort of try and get across this whole, yes, you can be aware of things, but you need to understand them in order to make use of that awareness. And I think there are science writers, or any writers really, who will gravitate towards, look at how complex this thing is and I understand it, whereas my approach is the opposite. my default assumption in everything I write is the reader is at least as smart as I am, which I would say is not an achievement, just but it's it is like my assumption. They just don't know what I know, so they're totally capable of understanding what I know. I
Yeah.
just need to say it in terms they will have encountered at some point. So I always try to talk to the reader as an equal or a potential superior. I think it's just, I mean, I guess I'm a sort of submissive person, perhaps by and large, but it comes across in that respect. And it also, I think, stems from my background. So I'm not a scientist from a classical background. I don't have anyone in my family who is of any academic standing. Like I'm the first member of my family to do A levels with UK
Yeah.
school exams for American listeners and viewers, and so like although my parents are really proud of me and are very sort of supportive, that support can only be in terms of again emotional support or like a morale or just sort of any sort of anything you want, just let us know. I said, can you explain the neuroanatomy of the brainstem to me? Nope, not going to happen because that's not a thing. They're doing like very few people can do that. It's not like a slur of my parents, but it was like I had to sort of figure things out for myself.
Yeah.
And so I had to my initial foray into the world was like, okay, so this word, this sentence, what does that mean? It means, and I would sort of instinctively translate it into layperson language because that's where I was coming from. But then, of course, I'd tell my family and friends who aren't neuroscientists about what I was up to all the time, and I had to sort of do that filter again. So what I'm doing is, oh yeah, what it is. So that was you know, it just became a habit to just translate things into plain speak for myself as much as anyone. And I will say, when it comes to the communication style, I know we mentioned this at the start. I was a comedian, but I always prefer to say I have done and will do stand-up comedy. I've never been paid to be a comedian beyond, well, never more than once, shall we say? So it's not been like a repeat gig at any point. But it was a hobby for quite a long time. But it obviously really informed my communication style because with most scientists or my science communicators, as good as they are and as adept as they are and as brilliant as they can be, it's usually, if not almost always, speaking to a group of people who are already interested in your ideas and have at least some baseline understanding, or at least enthusiasm and a desire to understand. Whereas when you're doing stand-up comedy, like open mic nights, you are going out in front of people who don't know you, have no reason to care about you or what you're going to say, and you have a very short space of time in order to win them over. So like I could go on stage and say, hello, who wants to hear about the hippocampal formation and how it pertains to contextual memories? Like, boo, that would have, I mean, rightly so. Like if you're in a pub and you've paid like £3 to watch some comedy, you don't want some nerds just lecturing you about memory formation functions. Unless it's built into something really hilarious, which it wouldn't be because it's not. And that is, something that I had to sort of work around. So, it's not just me. It's like something comedians tend to do. You get in front of people. You go, right, to win you over as quickly as possible in the most successful way as possible. Because otherwise, I can't do this. And that becomes a skill. It becomes a habit. It becomes a sort of just a trait you can do. And obviously, that's sort of infused into my writing, my communication styles anyway. So, it's not something I sort of consciously decided I would do this. It's just sort of an artifact of how I am, how I've developed. But I've managed to be able to use it in a useful way. But I will say it's really important to be able to get these ideas across because otherwise you just, it's just like, it's like, what's a good analogy? It's just like white noise sometimes, you look at the structure and stuff. Oh, it's like those people who go through books and sort of like trying to find, if you look at all the Bible, you take the third page and the fifth page, it spells bad is bad. Oh, that's a message. Like, well, yeah, I suppose, but it's not, it doesn't mean anything. It's just noise.
Yeah.
But when you don't if you try and get across to the people who are not interested, or at least give them the opportunity to be interested, it can be really useful. Like I've had people I know who are, on their job is to interview people for Cambridge University students. And apparently my books get cited all the time as inspirations to people who want to do medicine and neuroscience. And that's not something I ever planned, not something I ever expected to happen. It's immensely flattering, but it's also, it's not, it shows what can happen when you are willing to communicate with people who aren't necessarily already interested in your ideas. So yes, I think it's vitally important.
It's funny you mentioned performance because, and this is an aside, this isn't something I had planned to say as a kind of question, but
It's a conversation. It's fine.
you're a little bit, you're a little bit in the book about. I'm a bass player and player in a jazz band currently, and you're a little bit about freeform jazz being akin to somebody scraping the fingernails across a chalkboard. That made me have a little laugh to myself. So I don't know if I've forgiven you for that yet, but we'll
No.
see. One thing
Yeah.
you do talk about is how emotions are physiological and not just mental. So
Mm.
tell us a little bit more about that and specifically how tears are more than they seem to be on the surface.
Yeah, I mean that's something which was quite a profound realization early on. It's like Dr. Richard Firth Godby here pointed me to the first people who are credited as research in emotions, which was the Greek Stoics, from ancient Greece, and
Yeah.
their worldview was almost like proto-Vulcan. If it doesn't have any sort of tangible presence, if it's not logical and cannot be analyzed, then it's not really a thing. But they studied emotions because they correctly observed that emotions have a physical presence. And when we as reflected in our language too, in like the way we talk about emotions and emotional experiences, it's very physical. We have butterflies in our stomach, we have heartbreak, we are gone white as a sheet when it comes to fear, instead of green with envy, looking greener on the gills. These are all descriptions of physical responses to emotional experiences, and that's as it should be, because emotions do have a really powerful physical effect in the body. There's even the somatic marker hypothesis, which suggests that emotions actually start in the body. We experience something, our bodily functions, our body reacts to it in some way, and these smorgasbord of reactions is relayed to the brain, and the brain goes, "Oh, this is this sequence of things that happens when we're angry, so we must experience anger now." So like the brain is like the builder, and the body's the architect of emotions. So just send in the plans, and you make that. It's not the main theory of how emotions work. It's got a lot of flaws, but it's the fact that it is a theory in its own self shows how physiological emotions really are.
Within that context, then, you talk
Mm,
about the digestive system and the vagus nerve. How important are
mm.
these two emotions and how do they interact with the brain as an organ?
Yeah, well, it's one of those currently really hot areas of neuroscience and mental health stuff. The gut-brain axis, the link between the digestive system and the brain. The digestive system has its own quasi self-contained nervous system called the enteric nervous system, which is so complex it's often called the second brain. So it's that complex a nervous system, and somebody might be surprised that the digestive system of all the organs, the heart and lungs are more short-term importance, but they are fairly straightforward. Pump, 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 in, out, in, out, in, out. They do their functions are fairly mechanical, whereas the digestive system has to do a lot of stuff. It's the source of all fuel for your body, and all different sorts of fuels and substances are coming through the digestive system that have to be excreted, removed, passed through, reconstitute, all that stuff. So it's a really, really complex and vital system, second only to the brain in terms of complexity, according to many people's assessments. But there's a direct connection between brain and digestive system, and an indirect one. Indirectly, all the chemicals that enter your body come in through the digestive system and respiratory as well. But that's secondary. And as a result, what you eat forms how your body's, what your body's made up of. And that's obviously has a big impact on the brain. Like all the chemicals it's had access to and affecting it come from the digestive system. But also directly, there's the vagus nerve, the cranial nerves in the head. Like there are all these cranial nerves which link to the different parts of the head and connect to the brain, so it knows what's going on, all the eyes, ears, mouth, lips, and stuff. But there's one big one, the vagus nerve, which connects all the rest of your organs from below the neck to your brain. And it's sort of like the status of your organs is constantly being relayed to the brain by the vagus nerve. And when an organ is not going right, the vagus nerve is what tells the brain that. And when it's the digestive system, that's a particularly important one, because that's where everything comes through. It comes in through your body, and therefore there's a link, we believe, between the signals which are being relayed from the digestive system to the brain and depression and mental illness. Because I think like these signals are so fundamental. Like they predate consciousness, they predate awareness or anything like that. They go back to the deep fundamental layers of the brains. They don't manifest as your brain going, digestive system, ouchie, no. It's sort of a very deep and visceral, very sort of fundamental instinctive response, which is like negative emotion. So you feel a sort of weird unpleasantness, this negativity, which you can't really explain consciously because you don't see what's going on. The senses aren't really getting involved, but it's your body telling you things aren't right down here. And therefore we have depression or depression symptoms as a result of what's going on in our digestive system. So your emotions are clearly being heavily influenced by what's going on in your gut, thanks to the vagus nerve, which relays it. And the vagus nerve is like a big target of interventions for depression these days, like to stimulate the vagus nerve or applying drugs which can alter its conductivity or make it sort of send signals in a different manner. See if they shape or influence how we feel, because if it's the messages from the digestive system, the vagus nerve, which are being led to this experience of depression, then changing those messages would be a useful intervention, perhaps.
You do explore, following on from that kind of the fact that that's a hot topic in research at the moment. You do explore in the book the idea that basic emotions might not be altogether what researchers have always held them to be. So can you go into a little bit more about that in relation to like how the latest research is informing us on this?
Yeah, that was one of the things that made writing the book far more complex, because again, I thought it was settled science. It very much is not. Although it did seem to be for many years. The basic emotions model, that the idea that everyone has a set of basic emotions, just like everyone has five fingers on each hand. We're all just born with them. Like, they are fundamental. They are ingrained, genetically programmed into every single individual brain, and all our emotional experiences are some combination of these fundamental ones. And those fundamental ones were, anger, surprise, fear, disgust, happiness, sadness, usual suspects, essentially. And they were the result of work by a famous anthropologist and researcher, Paul Ekman, who went to a remote tribe and in New Guinea and studied the awareness of facial expressions, because until then it was widely argued that, or believed, that emotions were learned. If the facial expressions we show when we experience an emotion were learned, like we learn languages or we learn words. But he went to this remote tribe which had never contacted civilization, and they recognized the same facial expressions everyone else does. So they must be ingrained. That became the fundamental sort of emotions theory, which was the dominant one, and in many ways still is. But as time went on, a lot of people did more research and tried to replicate these studies, and particularly Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett, who found that it's really hard to replicate these findings, which the whole theory is based on, especially when you do candid shots. Like, if you give people pose huge, exaggerated faces like happiness, people tend to recognize them better. But when you do like candid shots, sort of take someone, so you have people get together, having interactions, take photos of their faces when they're not expecting it, and say to people, what emotion are they displaying? It becomes much, much, much harder. Like, accuracy drops through the floor. So it became sort of far more clear that context is a big part in this. And therefore, if you need context to say what people's facial expressions mean, then the idea that they're all fundamental and the same is nowhere, it's no near as robust as has been led to believe. Which sort of led to the constructivist worldview, which is that emotions are created essentially on the fly from a pool of like affect, which is like the raw building blocks of emotions. And every time we have an experience which requires an emotional response, our brain is sort of like conjuring up quickly, going, before this happened, I experienced anger, and like to put it all together in the moment, which sounds like inefficient. It sounds like a sort of a quite chaotic way of doing things, but the brain does that a lot. Like, our visual field is basically the brain doing that. It's got this raw, muddy data from the retinas, and it's polishing up and creating this whole rich visual experience from basic data in the moment, from moment to moment. And the same with memories as well. Like, they are essentially reconstructions of elaborate events from basic units which are connected together in sort of vague ways. So the brain is constantly just conjuring stuff up again and again and again as and when needed. And it's believed by many people that the emotions are the same, that we are just constantly throwing them together as and when we need it, which explains why emotions change over time, why we have different emotional experiences. We learn and we adapt and we refine our emotional experiences. If they were fundamental, we presumably wouldn't do that because it's like saying you can't decide how many fingers you have in each hand. It's just there. Whereas the emotions we can tweak and refine and mature and grow and regress and all that sort of stuff. So emotions are very volatile, far more so than you think if they were hardwired. In truth, as is usually the case, the brain is probably bit of A, bit of B. It's there probably are some fundamental emotional processes. We need some deep embedded neural tissue which is dedicated to this, and therefore that suggests there's a certain set pattern to it. But there's probably a lot more flexible than the basic emotions theory would suggest. And even that's been revised over time. Like even the people who believe in that, they argue over what emotions are the basic ones and whether sort of anger and fear are the same thing at a root level, or is they were like surprise one. Why surprise them there? That's not really emotion. That's a sensation, and
Yeah.
so on and so on. So yeah, always arguing, scientists, always arguing.
You explain how previously held notions about the limbic system and the left and right hemispheres aren't considered what they once were, but aren't entirely redundant when it comes to emotions. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean the limbic system was for many years the sort of catch-all label for bits of the brain which produce emotions. If like the triune brain system, like the reptile, limbic, neocortex, or like basically reptile, mammal, human. The idea that the brain has three layers: very basic, mid complexity, super complex. I know that is certainly true in a sense, because obviously the very basic fundamentals of the brain, the next level evolved out of those, like your brainstem, all the basic physiological stuff, heart rates and lungs and blood flow and hormone release and stuff. That's fundamental. That's really a reptile brain. Out of that grew the more complex stuff, emotions, memories, certain reflexive instincts, and so on. And that's the mammal brain. And on top of that, out of that came the neocortex, the big wrinkly bit on top. Humans, thought, language, imagination, supervision, not supervising people. I mean, super enhanced eyesight. Let's go with that. So that was that's the model, but it's obviously as in most things, it's a bit crude and complex for the reality of the brain. But for a long time, is assumed that the middle bit, the limbic system, was where emotions came from. So obviously, they're more complex than basic reflexes and blood flow mechanisms, but they are less complex than imagination and self-awareness and thought and logical analysis. But since then, it's been shown that there's far more overlap. That the systems are far more intertwined with thinking and rationalization and so on and so on. So it's not a fair assessment of how the brain is structured, but the label is still used as a sort of general term for bits of the brain which deal with emotion, which is in some respects it's almost all of it. But that's too vague. But yeah, it's the limbic system, the limbic processes are still used to describe emotions, and that is fair enough. But then there's the whole left brain, right brain thing. I don't know which one it is. I think it's right, which is emotion, isn't it? Or left is analytical. Like left, right themselves. I often
I'm going to defer to the neuroscientists.
Yeah. Well, regardless of what it is, that's clearly the idea that one hemisphere of the brain is responsible for emotions and the other is responsible for rational thinking and logic is a wildly, oversimplifying way of looking at things. And it's, I was quite dismissive of that for a long time. Like, oh, God's sake, that's so stupid that people believe that sort of stuff. And I even saw it today, on one GIF or meme doing the rounds of Facebook saying, is this a fish or a mermaid? If you've got a left brain, you think this. No, that's not a thing. But there is, functional differences in that the right brain is big picture stuff, and the left is fine details and analysis and sort of close up. So if anything, the right is the woods, the left is the trees, and that's sort of a more useful way of looking at things. And you can sort of see how that would play into emotions, because if you are look at the grand scheme of things, taking everything into account, then you probably would be more inclined towards the including the emotional aspects of things, the emotional impact. Whereas, like on the other hand, obviously, if you look at the fine details of being very granular, the emotional qualities will probably escape you because you can't zoom in on emotions. It's like trying to sort of look at the individual letters in a joke and see where the comedy is. Like, to
Yeah.
take all delete all the vowels. It's not it doesn't work like that. So you can sort of see how that might sort of manifest as some sort of difference in emotional or rational approaches. But yeah, the idea that one hemisphere does this, the other hemisphere does that is, it's a wild oversimplification. So as lower down to admit there is a left brain, right brain reality, there is, but it's nowhere near as easily quantified as the mainstream portrayal would suggest.
Yeah, kind of related to that then. And, you mentioned earlier about the kind of end of universe anxiety that some
Mm.
cosmologists suffer. Uh, do you think this also plays a role in fringe or pseudoscience, such as young Earth creationism? And if so, do you think there is more emotional influence in this regard than in mainstream science? Or do you think it's an individual, on an individual basis, and it doesn't really matter whether you believe fringe things, whether you're a mainstream scientist, it's something entirely different that contributes to our kind of
Mm.
emotional responses to these things?
I think there will be similar processes at work in both groups. I think it's a Nietzsche quote that Chris Blackwell mentioned to me. He who has learned to be anxious in the right way has learned the infinite. So, it argues that the great thinkers and philosophers and scientists of the past were just like nervous and anxious about not knowing, and therefore, but not in a way which made them put their fingers in the ears and go la 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 la, put their head in the sand, or any other metaphor you want to use. It's one like, well, if I need to find out, then I need to sort of figure this out, and that anxiety is a good motivator. It's established in a lot of psychological principles, like the Yerkes-Dodson curve, or the idea that the closer you get to deadline, the more stressed you are, the better your performance up until a certain point. In which case, once you go past that, your stress becomes debilitating. So it defeats the ability to function, and then you sort of become more and more chaotic, and you don't work as well. So it's a curve, and a lot of scientists will have this. I mean, I talked to a professor, I think she is now, Katie Mack, but people who she works with who see this model of the universe just fade into nothingness, infinite nothingness, just with the heat death, and just don't like that. I mean, there's more to it than that. It's not like that's the definitely 100% established, confirmed fact, but it's like, well, that's a very bleak, bleak view of the universe. Maybe there is something more to, to these other theories, and so it motivates them to study other things. And so emotions arguably can alter the outcome of the universe. That's a very, very tenuous way of putting it, but it sounded good in the book, so I said it anyway. But
It's interesting because I mean I love one of my other great loves as a layperson beyond neuroscience is cosmology. So I was my ears pricked up as soon as I sort of heard that, and when I was listening to the audio book. But I love that. But I kind of expanding on that and also bridging it to something you talk about later in the book, which is kind of the influence that social media and being online
mm,
has. You asked the question, if we could get rid of emotions, should we? And as someone who is an educator in skepticism and critical thinking, I come across people, especially those according with religious people all the time, who like to pretend that atheism somehow equals a Vulcan aptitude for logic.
mm,
So not
yeah.
only is this not the case, as as any of us who've done any even layman level research know, but as someone who talks about critical thinking a lot, I try and acknowledge and explain that we are emotional creatures. So, what's your take from the neuroscientist point of view on how we lean on emotions during emotive issues, especially online? And how does
Mm.
talking to someone on social media, for example, differ in this regard from talking to people face to face?
Yeah, and that's obviously a massive aspect of modern life, and it actually feeds into the previous question, like the sort of your conspiracy theorists, your flat earthers, although they may have a similar anxiety about, I don't understand the world, and I want to not feel that anxiety. What they can do now, which is a lot harder in the old days, what they can do is they can find people online who will provide them with answers We provide them with a worldview which is comforting and makes them feel better. And you think logically, that should it's the same should be said of science. So science says this is how it works, and these people online with names like OK Crypto 41593, like he's not a scientist. I'm assuming he has some very strange spellings, but they say something else. But that's the person you sort of end up gravitating towards if you're of that sort of mindset.
Yeah.
And it's emotions are a huge part of that, because although you're a scientist, you want to have a logical, reasonable, rational answer to these issues and concerns, you might not get one. The world isn't going to be beholden to our emotional needs. It's a complex place, and we might never figure it out. At least within a lifetime. So you have to be sort of content with that potential outcome. But that also feeds into scientists are more emotional than you think, because obviously the mainstream portrayal of scientists is as these sort of aloof, stoic, rational people who are just like confounded by your human emotions, and like Mr. Spock. But to think of what it means to be a scientist in the modern world, you have to dedicate your life to answering a question or to looking into an issue which has got no answers. There's no point to being a scientist. You have to find these things out, and you have to put the time into working up a theory or a model or hypothesis. Then you got to try and prove it and study it, and you have to fight for grants and resources. You have to change countries and residences many times to do that. And publish or perish, you got to fight against other people for the same diminishing pool of resources. And then you got to dedicate your life to this idea you've had. You can spend 20, 30 years running the same group of experiments. And the end of the result might be, no. I know that's, technically, if you're a very smart person, that's not a logical way to live your life. If you've got a high intellect, you can, well, there are much easier ways to live. I could just get into investment or finance or literally anything else. I could do something and not have to leave the house. But scientists do it because they want to, because they are passionate about it, because they are emotionally invested in this, this idea of improving the world, discovering something. That's an emotional motivation. Scientists have to be emotional to that extent as well. The process of science can't have emotions in it. That's why there's so many things in place to prevent it from happening. I mean, if anything, that's an acknowledgement that scientists are people and have emotions themselves. So it's not perfect, it's not flawless, but there are checks and balances to keep emotions out of the process. But emotions are needed to make the process happen at all. So it's a bit of a sort of balancing act there. And but the social media side of things, I think I mentioned the book, but imagine in 1983, like you sat in the pub with like a group of friends, and you just sort of lull the conversation. You say, you know what? I think the world is flat. Like they just stare at you for 2 minutes. Hey, flat Earth Dave! Like after he comes to the pub the next 3 weeks, oh, flat Earthy boy, fall off the edge yet? Woo, woo, woo. And he's going to be going to be low status for a while. He's got to have his opinions and views not positively reinforced, and they'll potentially keep him to himself. And he'll learn. Oh, I won't say that again because that got me really humiliated. And those ideas then, without nourishment, without reinforcement, wither. Because you sort of learn that don't hold on to those. That's not the outcome anymore, and that's one of the things I think is perhaps the biggest danger of the internet. None of this whole ruins your attention span or anything like that. It's everything is a tool in its own right, but the fact you can now go online and find someone who agrees with you, no matter how wild or ridiculous or dangerous your ideas are, you will find a community which says, "Yeah, you're right," and we need that. Humans are ultra social creatures, and that means we prioritize connection, we prioritize positive reinforcement from others above most other things. There's this, in the way of the internet, there was a thing called normative information influence, whereby if done studies, group of 10 people around a table, show them 2 lines, say which one's longer, a long one or a short one. Well, the obvious answer is the long one. But if 9 out of 10 people say the short one, the last person, who is the only actual subject of this experiment, the rest all plants, will say, yeah, the short one's longer, even though they know it's not, and they can clearly see it's not. But the fact that everyone else says it is makes them doubt themselves, makes them not want to rock the boat, makes them not want to be the outcast. It's a really, really powerful effect that we don't really appreciate. It's an emotional one. We don't want to be emotionally rejected by others, and now we can find other people who will emotionally validate all our most ridiculous theories and ideas and yearnings if we want to, if we don't find that in the mainstream world. So online gives us that. It's not the same as having face-to-face reinforcement. But of course, it's a basis for that. You can then meet up and share ideas. So yeah, so like that's one of the things I'm the most wary of when it comes to social media world, that people have this ability to find anyone who will agree with them anyway, and that's not a good thing for how the human brain works.
No. Talking about how the human brain works, memory seems to be vitally important to emotions, not just in remembering emotional times, but in how the brain operates on a daily basis. So can you expand a little bit more on that? I know you did your doctorate on memory, so it's a very fascinating area to go into.
Yes. Yeah, so believe it or not, I can expand on that. Yes, I spent 5 years studying it. I will talk about it given the opportunity. Yeah, so emotions and memories are really highly intertwined. And to make sense of that, you've got to sort of think of the fact that emotions and memory are more fundamental systems than rational thought and analysis and imagination and language and the more recent neurological developments. So, for a long time in the history of our species and our ancestor species and our evolution, emotions and memory went hand in hand because we didn't think about the world; we just had emotional reactions to it. And therefore, that's when that's what was happening when our memory system first evolved. So our brain still defaults to that we haven't developed a new memory system since. It's only been a few million years since we've had the ability to think. So we're still using the same old memory system, which means that emotional experiences are what the memory prioritizes, which explains a lot. It explains like when you study for an exam, like you objectively know this information is important. I need to know this. But it's not any emotional salience beyond the sort of low-level anxiety of failing your exam. But that's not attached to the information itself. That's just, the situation. So when you have to revise something, you have to sort of like read it again and again and again and try and do tricks to remind yourself of stuff and so on and so on. Because it's abstract information. It doesn't have any emotional salience for you. So like that's why you can cram for weeks for an exam, and then sit down in the exam hall and get your paper, and then write, okay, I remember most of it, and then get enough to pass. And then like 3 weeks later, you don't remember any of it because you haven't used it since and it has no emotional relevance. So your brain just goes, well, don't need that anymore. Whereas an emotional experience, the exact opposite. So, when you're a teenager, perhaps you were just walking on the street, maybe your trousers fell down one day in front of everyone. You don't need to remember that. That's not a good memory. You don't want to remember that, but it'll haunt you for the rest of your life. And that's going to just pop up randomly every 2 minutes sometimes. You can walk on the street again and suddenly go, just cringe into a ball because it was a powerful emotional memory. And that's where your brain goes, oh, that was important. I'll keep hold of that. And therefore, the emotional stuff we experience is the most significant in our memory. But our memories because our memories are like the basis of our identity, our sense of self, that obviously has, emotional experiences have a big impact on who we are, who we become, how we end up forming and developing. And your brain has systems in place to try and mediate this, to modulate it, like the fade and affect bias, which is a really interesting one. The fact that in the short term, negative emotional experiences are the most significant. They like command the most attention because your brain is very, very wary of threats, any sort of dangers, anything negative. Your brain goes, oh, just keep an eye on that in case it's bad. Whereas positive emotional experiences tend to be more broad. Like your brain's going, oh, let's absorb all information. This is nice. We don't pay attention to anything specific. Just enjoy this. And so in the short term, negative experiences are the most significant, but they fade faster than memory. So as your memory gets older, the negative emotional quality goes away, like chewing gum. The flavor's gone. You still got the gum, the substance is there, still present, but you don't have the flavor anymore. Just the recollection that it was nice once. Whereas positive memories don't do that. Not so much anyway. They linger, like the flavor keeps coming and coming and coming. Like every time you think back to it, that's why you have like all those treasured memories. So the older your memory is, the further back it goes, the more positive it'll be because there's been more time for the negative ones to fade, which is why older people tend to reminisce fondly about the old days far more than they should. So, oh, it was great back then. Oh, it was lovely. But yeah, you remember the good stuff. The bad stuff you've forgotten.
Yeah.
Like my parents sort of yell at their teenage kids, but they've forgotten the negative parts of being a teenager because they're older now. And that's why my grandparents would always be very double standard. We talked about this recently. Like I was when I went to school, the secondary school, like it was living in the valley, so it was school like 7 miles away. and we had buses to take us there, and they were rejects from the city buses in Cardiff. Like they were not safe for Cardiff, like the public, so they give it to our school, which is great.
School kids will do.
Yeah. Like Valley school kids are expendable. So I mean, they caught fire often, and like windows fell out and stuff. It was a death trap. But I was telling my mother about this, my grandparents around, and the grandparents' first thing was like, "Oh, do you know how lucky you are? When I was your age, I had to walk 10 miles to school every day in the snow over broken glass." I mean, very clearly exaggerating. And then within like 3 or 4 minutes, go, school days, the best days of your life, they are mine. Like, really, that you walking 10 miles a day over jagged glass, that was your best day? Yeah, like, come on, guys, pick a lane, stick to it. So, it does, it makes nostalgia a very powerful force. And as we've seen, not the most constructive one, but it's a thing.
I mean, leading on from that, the chapter on smell to
Mm.
me was fascinating. It was my personal favorite chapter in the book, actually, and I
I'll
think
take
it's
it.
one of those chapters that could easily be extended into a full-length book on its own.
Mm.
The early evolution of the sense of smell, it's linked to memory, and indeed it's linked to emotions. It was
Mm.
gave me I actually found myself deeply like stopping while I was listening to it and kind of deeply reflecting on what was being said and like really thinking about it. So, why is the sense of smell so important in emotions?
Yeah, I mean, no, the thing where it sort of comes back to is the Proustian moment. As in Proust again. I've heard it pronounced two ways. I'll say Proust. Is eating a small Madeleine cake from his when he's like in his 50s and ate it, and then some flashback to his childhood where his aunt used to, or his grandmother used to. I can remember the details, ironically. He said he'd dip him in a tea and stuff. So, like, he had this vivid memory of his childhood from just in tasting certain cake. And a more modern example would be Ratatouille, the movie Ratatouille, like
Yeah.
the end of that when he eats the Ratatouille. And that's what that is. That's a Proustian moment. Obviously, it's a film based in France about food. So that's a deep literature reference. But it's something everyone knows that we all remember fond memories from our childhood and stuff, but a smell can be far more evocative than any other sense. You smell a certain smell from your childhood, and suddenly you go, oh, you're taken back there in a far more significant way than any other sensory stimulation. And neuroanatomically, that's because smell has a sort of VIP pass to the memory and emotion system. So memory and emotion, as we've seen, are heavily intertwined anyway. And most senses come into the brain, go to their relevant brain region for processing, like the occipital lobe for vision, the auditory cortex for hearing, and then that information gets sent to the thalamus, like the big hub in the middle of the brain, and then that's relayed to the emotion and memory system to form a new memory. Smell doesn't do that. Smell just goes straight in, skips all the thalamus stuff, and it's hard to sort of pin this down in any concrete way because it was so long ago. We haven't got any sort of record to back it up, but based on my readings, what I would say is likely to have happened is that smell was the first sense to evolve. I mean, I think that's well known because it's the first smell to develop in the womb. It's technically our most sensitive sense, so it's the most well refined and stuff. And when you think of the earliest days of life, what was life in the primordial ooze? It was like complex bundles of chemicals in a complex chemical environment. So life was just chemicals upon chemicals. When it comes to senses, the only thing you need to know is what's happening in the chemicals around you, what's changing in the chemicals around you. And what is that if not smell? You're just detecting the chemicals around you. No, different chemical, new chemical, and stuff like that. And that's a very sort of profound thing to think about. So when we first started evolving smell and sense and memory, like it was smell and memory were sort of we had to evolve in lockstep. And that would therefore mean they were linked together. But then you have this memory, you retain information. There's no point in sensing something if you can't do anything with information. So you retain it and you react to it. And the reaction is an emotional response because it's way before the time of thought. So that means like as the brain was developing, evolving over many millions of years, it was doing so being heavily influenced by smell and emotions and memory. So those three things are deeply intertwined in the structure of our brain. I mean, smell and memory are so intertwined that in the early days of neuroscience, they thought the memory system was the olfactory system. They're so close together, like they just look the same from the outside. It'll delve in quite deep to see, oh, this is a memory thing, poke with a stick, and then people forget their name. And that's it was for a while. It was thought to be all olfactory in there because it's so overlapping, so intertwined. So yeah, memory and smell and emotion very, very fundamentally linked.
You talk throughout the book about the loss of your father and the emotional turmoil you were going through when writing the book. But I'm
Hmm.
really interested in how looking back at the book now that it's been published, and you are talking about it with people like me, how that affects you emotionally. Have you found looking back, you have a greater emotional response to this book when talking about it because of the connection with your dad than you have had looking back on your previous books?
Yeah. This is definitely the most emotionally loaded book of mine. Because obviously it was a real time. Uh, it's probably excessive to say grief journal, but there's certainly elements of that in it. And I think in what I mentioned in the book, as I write this, I am in the throes of grief. But by the time I finish it, I'll come back to it 6 months later, and I'll feel differently. So I was like thrown ahead to my future emotional responses, knowing that I would feel differently because that's how it works. But I think I did a footnote to, yep, it's me again. I'm back 6 months later. It got very meta, that bit in hindsight, but I was, I thought it was important. But yeah, it's definitely the most emotional book I've written. It's definitely the most personal. And in terms of like personal journey, like the first four books I wrote were obviously big efforts on my part, but in hindsight, they were like sort of like wrapping the bandages on my gloves before the fight. This book
Yeah.
is like the actual battle of. Obviously, I said I didn't know about emotions, and I was going through all this, and that really my father passing during COVID and having to deal with that in lockdown was like the in my sort of my entry, my way into the world of emotions, because I wasn't just like a casual observer when I kind of knew coming to the field. I was like, right, I got brain knowledge and I've certainly got emotions right now. So let's see if I can, square that circle. And I did, that's the whole point of the book. So this is the book I definitely look back and I think that was the one which I had to write. And the ones I'm all very proud of. This one was like, because I was like, I was alone beside my wife and kids, of course, during lockdown with the massive grief going on, the trauma of that. So this book is like it was a very therapeutic thing to be able to go through, to be able to write this all down and express it in such ways. So that was it's very personal in that respect, yeah. So it's definitely the most personal one. Um, it's really like it's not my most light-hearted book by any stretch of the imagination, but I did actually get a review for the Daily Mail, a very positive review. It said it was very funny. I thought, oh, thank you. I think glad you enjoyed? Question mark. Which bit are you laughing at? Because that is disconcerting. But again, but I think the act of writing it means I can come back at it now and be far more uh, neutral is too strong a term, but far more relaxed about it, far more able to engage with it. Because there was a while and I struggled to look at it because it was important to write, but to relive was another matter. But now I got some distance from it, time, wounds, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Um, but it was really useful to be able to write it at all. It's a really cathartic experience and nothing else. So that was important as well. So yes, it's a book I'm very proud of, but also a book that was necessary for me in the way the other ones weren't so much.
Yeah, it's great reading that aspect. And say it's great. I mean, with a certain tone, but it's great reading that aspect
Mm,
of yourself in the book. It's not just another kind of dry science read. And I mean, maybe I'm looking on it with kind of tinted glasses myself because I lost my own mom during the pandemic. Both my parents
mm.
are dead. And she died suddenly. She caught COVID and died suddenly. So it kind of I had a lot of emotional kind of response to your book because of what I'd been through, having
Right, yeah.
lost my parent in the pandemic as well. And and talking about that kind of empathy, you talk about in the book, you talk about mirror neurons. And you say that, we haven't yet seen them in humans, but there's a large amount of evidence that suggests that
Mm.
they might be present. What is that evidence? And is it enough for neuroscientists like yourself to confidently attach them to emotional responses?
Yeah, it's a tricky one to sort of pin down because it's a sort of thing where you could do these sort of things in animal subjects. Some people object to that, but it's a different ethical question to stick probes in the head of a healthy human who may not want that. And that's, whatever you think of the divide between animals and humans, those are the rules, those are the laws. So you can't just go around probing people, despite what some extraterrestrials seem to think. But it's hard to sort of do that in humans anyway. But yeah, because we are more complex in that respect than our primate cousins, it does seem there's all this evidence that we display the same behaviors and the same responses that you would expect if we had mirror neurons. But we have like certain brain regions think, oh, they must be in there. Or if they're not, then this part of the brain is doing the same thing as mirror neurons do, or like they replicate the same function.
Yeah.
Because evolution is quite conservative like that. It will sort of just keep things which work or adapt them and modulate them and tweak them rather than create something wholly new. Which is, it's a good thing. It helps us get stuff done. But yeah, it would be at this point extremely weird if we didn't have them, because obviously all the stuff we do, if anything, we are more prone to those behaviors than non-humans. So like mirror neurons are, the ones in chimps, whereby if you observe someone else doing something, the mirror neurons sort of activate in response to their actions, not yours. So like if you're a chimp, you see a chimp raise their arm, mirror neurons sort of trigger activity which would be arm raising, but they don't do it when you do it. They don't do it when you see it. So it's a way to the primate brain to learn by observation. We can see them doing it, and therefore our brain works out how that happens, and we can do it ourselves.
I'm kind of a layman, as we've already touched upon when talking about neuroscience and psychology. My own academic field is religious studies and philosophy, so I'm literally the man in the street when it comes to neuroscience books and articles like yours, which make very complicated subjects very accessible. But are they oversimplifying the field, do you think, so that people think this is how the brain is, rather than this is a model of how the brain behaves? And how much do you think neuroscience and psychology actually overlap? Do you think that psychology is a place in the study of neuroscience? Did your own doctorate on memory and the work of people like Dr. Julius Shaw, who's a psychologist who's done a lot of work on memory, do they marry? Do those two fields marry when it comes to kind of brain science on the whole? And how does it kind of inform emotions?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really have psychology without neuroscience, and neuroscience is essentially, there's not much point to it without psychology. They are really, really heavily intertwined, and there's a huge overlap. I mean, like my PhD was in the School of Psychology, so neuroscience is sort of under the same umbrella in many ways. So psychology is like what happens, and neuroscience is where it happens and how. You could almost say like psychology is software, neuroscience is hardware. I mean, but it's, again, that's far too clear cut again. So it is, it's really hard to separate the two. I mean, like a lot of my work is, from all intents and purposes, just psychology. Throw a few brain cells in, now it's neuroscience, and that's apparently the mainstream way of looking at it. But yeah, you're right. There is a risk of it being oversimplified. It has happened in the past. I mean, in my second book, I talked to Professor Chris Chambers about the early days of brain scanning and how there was sort of this big plethora of studies which hit the news because you could do it now. So, but they would basically put someone in a brain scanner, make them play chess, and bits would light up. It was, it's the chess center of the brain, and this blob appeared on the screen. And see, that's how it works. No, that whole era is called jokingly blobology. So a blob, there must be what that is, and that is a massive oversimplification, if not just flat out wrong portrayal of how the brain works. It's all about networks and different levels of activity, and even like if you say you're playing chess, like what parts of the brain you use, what are you doing at that particular point in time? What does the activity mean? Is it the activity you get when you're thinking of next chess move? Is it the activity you get when you see a black and white checkerboard? Is it thinking about chess and thinking about the film chess, or the musical chess, or the TV show about the Queen's Gambit? And the brain's doing so many different things when any stimulus. What is it doing? What are we looking at in this activity? So this idea that you can just put them in a scanner and read their mind is a huge oversimplification and actively misleading. But the idea that there must be a brain region for everything isn't helpful. Like brain's all about systems and networks and collaboration, and so many different parts working together. So it's very more complex than that. So yeah, this idea that there's a source in the brain for everything beyond the most fundamental stuff, and even then it becomes kind of murky. That is, kind of misleading, and something I actually try and push back against where I can. But you need psychology and neuroscience to do that. And yeah, emotions are very much embroiled in this. Like emotions are woven throughout the brain, like veins through marble. And I keep getting asked, where in the brain do emotions come from? To which I usually say yes, because that doesn't answer my question. Well, you have to ask a proper question, because otherwise I can't ask you, because it's not. They come from the brain and the body. Beyond that, we need different questions. We need different vocabulary, a different way of looking at this. So, yeah. So, like the fundamentals of emotions are far more complex than just like, oh, that's the emotion bit, that's the memory bit, that's the psych bit, and you need a broad spectrum of understandings of disciplines to get to the marrow of that.
Absolutely. Dr. Dean Burnett, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I have enjoyed your books, including this one,
Glad to hear it.
Emotional Ignorance. I encourage everybody who watches this video to go out and buy that if you're not done already. Listen
I'd
to the
appreciate
audio,
that,
do what
yes.
I've done and buy the book and listen to the audio book because it's great whichever format
Yeah.
you kind of take it
And
in.
it's not me reading it, so no, you haven't got to listen to this anymore. That's fine.
It really is a brilliant book. I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and I shall continue to be so.
Appreciate that.
I think let those who are watching who are new to Dr. Dean Burnett, and the first time you've heard him speak, go out and seek all of his work. It's really worthwhile to do so. Dean, tell us a little bit about what you're currently up to and where people can find, follow, and support you.
I'm currently working on the publication of my sixth book, whilst writing the seventh, because I get bored easily, it turns out. Also on my website, deanburnett.com. All my links and things are on there. Currently looking at a few international trips later on this year, but those are TBC. But yes, I'll probably be making the rounds in the UK at least, hopefully beyond September time when my next book is published. So that's going to be an interesting one. Hopefully that goes down well as well.
Lovely. Thank you very much for joining me.